Good morning and welcome back to Biology 102 Tea Time. Today we're talking about community ecology. To get started today, communities are all the living things in a given area. So in my picture over here, we have all the grasses and herbs. You can see the cheetah, the prey item of the cheetah. So all of those living things in a particular space like the Serengeti would be a community. Community ecologists then are interested in studying two or more living things and their interactions, or two or more populations and their interactions. A simple study might be like this lynx and a snowshoe hare and studying a predator-prey interaction. Communities are all of these living things, so they can be quite complicated beyond just predators and prey. It can be parasites and the things that the snowshoe hare needs in order to live as well. So they can be quite complicated with many, many organisms living in one space. A community ecologist might describe a community with four primary factors, and there are a few others off of the list, but this gives you an idea of how we start to describe and define what a community really looks like. So one thing a community ecologist might describe is species diversity. Species diversity is the variety and types of different species living within a particular area. This is one component of biodiversity. And in order to tell us something about species diversity, typically researchers will go out and they will list not only species richness, so the number and the types of different organisms. Species richness is almost like a list of different living things that are living in a particular space. And species abundance is how many of those types of organisms are living. Sometimes that's by percent and sometimes that's by estimated numbers. But the numbers and varieties of species is that component of species diversity. A community ecologist might also tell you something about prevalent vegetation type. This is because vegetation, or your producers in a particular community, are often keystone species. They are often species that a lot of different living things are relying upon, either for like habitat, for food sources, for shelter, nesting grounds, mating grounds, these kinds of things in order to complete their life cycles. Prevalent vegetation type also tells us something about habitat type and variety and niche potentials for a particular community. So habitat is a description of the type of vegetation and other resources within a particular area. Niche potentials, niche is actually the sum total of species use of all the living and non-living resources within a particular area. And so niche potentials are really like the jobs that are possible for the different living things within a particular space. You can imagine that in a rainforest, a tropical rainforest, a habitat description would have this description of a layered canopy with very tall trees, understory trees, ground cover all the way to the ground. That would be very different, that habitat description, over something like a desert that just has like scrub sort of low-lying plants and ground for organisms to live. Niche potentials also within those two communities would be quite different. The potential niches inside of a tropical rainforest would include arboreal living, so living in the canopy, on branches, on the trunks of very tall trees, understory life sort of styles where you would be utilizing that understory, all the way to ground and ground cover, different things that are utilizing that ground space in order to live. Those niche potentials would be very different than in a desert where you see organisms that are, maybe burrowing underground or using the ground as perches, or very low-lying vegetation. So the third thing a community ecologist might use to define or describe a community is community stability. Community stability includes either a community's resisting change to begin with, right? Resisting changes or disturbances that come along, or its ability to return to its original species composition. This is sometimes known as a climax community, this original kind of species grouping that lives in a particular area. Different communities often will have different strategies for how they actually either resist changes or return quickly to their original species composition. And so you can see something like maybe a cedar grove in California that is quite old with very large trees being able to resist changes like windstorms and floods and fires and various things like that happen. Whereas a Palouse prairie might sort of not resist change so much. It can quite quickly change, but it can also quite quickly return to its original species composition. Replanting a grassland is quite a bit easier, right, than replanting trees that are thousands of years old. So there are different strategies within communities to like sort of create this stability for organisms over time. And lastly, to define a community ecologist might talk something about trophic structures or feeding relationships. So who's eating who, and develop pictures of who these, predator, prey, also producers and things like that are required, and these trophic or these feeding relationships within a community. Now, community ecologists are also interested not only in describing these basic sort of properties that would define a community, but also the interactions between the living things. That's also quite important. So I want to look at 3 common interactions: competition, predation and herbivory, and then symbiotic relationships. So we're going to start with competition. Competition is the fight for any kind of resource within a particular space. This can be for food, it can be for shelter, it can be for habitat or perch space, nesting grounds, this kind of thing. At the turn of last century, in the early 1900s, there were a few ecologists that were working on competition to really define like what happens in a community. And one of those ecologists from Russia, a Russian ecologist named Gregory Gauss, did some freshwater studies and looked at different kinds of freshwater organisms like these 2 paramecium over here. Gregory Gauss grew them in separate sort of freshwater systems, and he would get these nice logistic curves where they would like kind of hit the ceiling on different resources like algae and things like that they were needed for their life cycle, and then they would kind of plateau or hit that carrying capacity and sort of flatten out their curves. But he also grew these species in competition in combined cultures, and what he noticed over a series of experiments was that this top species would always outcompete, it's in red up here, this lower species that would be driven to extinction. From these freshwater studies, Gauss came up with what sometimes is called Gauss's law. I'm going to call it the competitive exclusion principle. This principle states that no 2 species can occupy the same niche at the same time in the same community. And so competitive exclusion tells us that if you have identical niches and you're in direct competition, then oftentimes this can't occur between 2 species. What are the common results? In this case, right, with our paramecium, one species was kind of driven to extinction or actually would fall out of the system, and the other would survive and carry forward. So some of the common results might be that one sort of lesser able to like sort of keep up species. In the case of our paramecium, one is more efficient at like sort of getting energy from its food sources. The top species would drive the other one to extinction. The other thing that we see happening is that if you are in direct competition and the niches are identical for a particular space at a particular time, then if you shift your niche ever so slightly, then sometimes you can partition up the different niches in a particular community, so you're no longer in direct competition. This is called niche partitioning or resource partitioning, and we see this happening as well, where if you are in direct competition, maybe you change slightly the prey item that you're eating, or change the timing at which you're hunting for different organisms within a particular space, or you change your niche ever so slightly so that you're not in direct competition anymore. The next kind of interaction that a community ecologist might be interested in are these really almost co-evolved predator and prey relationships, and herbivores with their herbs. Predation is a consumer or a predator that eats a prey item or another organism. Herbivory is where an herbivore eats a plant, right? And in both of these cases, these kinds of organisms, that predator and prey that are actually like eating each other or trying to escape from their predators, will often have bags of tricks that they have like sort of adapted over time in order to help them survive in this particular community with these relationships going on. Adaptations develop in these groups through natural selection. So natural selection works on a population to change it over time. And a lot of these kinds of adaptations will then help organisms survive their predators or survive their herbivores more effectively inside of a community. We see things like camouflage developing in predator-prey like sort of situations where the prey, this enables them, a camouflage enables them to actually escape their predator more effectively. And that kind of camouflage, that kind of adaptation can be naturally selected over time and kind of accumulate within these populations in order to sort of help these organisms survive over time so that they are more like sort of adapted to the environments and the different other living things within a particular space. The last kind of important relationship I want to mention is a symbiotic relationship. This is an interaction between two or more species that live in close contact for long periods of time, sometimes their entire life cycles. I show a picture of a lichen over here on some rocks, and I don't know if you know what a lichen is, but a lichen is a combination of a couple of different things. It's some kind of photosynthesizer, so something that can capture sunlight and make sugars, something like an algae or a cyanobacteria, and then coupled with a fungus. And the fungus gives the algae or the photosynthesizer different kinds of nutrients, water, sometimes protection and shielding from the sun. And then the algae gives the fungus sugars and other things that can be gathered from like sunlight. And so the two like sort of live together for their entire life cycles. They live in close contact and they have what we call a mutualistic relationship. So within symbiosis, there's a couple of big types that we see: parasitism and mutualism. Parasitism I show as a plus minus. This is where a parasite steals some energy from a host organism. This can be like ticks or malaria, lots of different parasitic worms that we see within communities. And so this can be like a close association where one organism benefits and gains something and the other one loses something in that transaction. Mutualism, like our lichen, is a plus plus, where both organisms are benefiting from a particular association. These associations we see in all kinds of communities. We see very complicated sort of interactions, and these long-term close associations are quite common within groups of living things. Last thing I want to mention about community ecology and communities is that communities can change over time. They're not static entities that never change, but rather disturbances, things that can damage communities or at least temporarily change the communities and the organisms, affect communities all the time. So fires, floods, weather disasters, temperature fluctuations, new organisms, so introduced species or invasive species, all of these things can disturb a community and change it over time. Community succession is the study of how communities change over time. And there's a couple of different types of succession. There is primary succession. This is where an area is colonized but starts without soil. So you have to build your soil. Lichen, that species I was just talking about with mutualism, is actually one of our soil builders. It can sit on top of rocks and break them down and help build soil and things like that in a particular space. Moss is another example of something that often can break down rocks over time. And then secondary succession usually is much shorter because the colonization starts with soil. So when we look at these two kinds of succession, primary is a little bit longer because you have no soil to start with. Secondary typically is a little bit shorter in time frame because you're starting with that soil and everything kind of built in it. When we look at our natural disasters up here, natural sort of disturbances, Things like fires and floods that just go across the surface may leave some of your soil intact. So that would be more of a secondary succession. Things like new volcanoes forming under the ocean and then throwing up lava that then builds up into new islands, that might be more of an example of primary succession. Having said that, some areas like volcanic eruptions can have an area near the cone, which is primary, where all the soil gets taken away via lava or the explosion, those kinds of things. And then you can have secondary at the sort of base where maybe fires and the lava and the heat has killed off just the top organisms but left the soil intact. So you can have like combinations of this as well. So I hope this gives you an overview of some of the characteristics of communities that scientists study. I will see you next time.